And welcome to those who have joined us for today's ucisa London Group Digital Poverty event. Just a quick message on housekeeping. Um, in relation to today's event, we're encouraging and welcoming you to, if you have questions, post messages in the chat during the presentations. We've got a variety of speakers touching on the topic of digital poverty for you here today. And we are asking, as just in terms of housekeeping, if you could, if you're not posing a question, just maybe keep your cameras off, your microphones muted during today's event. All right. So that leads us into obviously the starting of today's event, the digital poverty event hosted by the ucisa London Group. Just to give a little bit of background, the pandemic has taught us a lot of things about working from home. And also in light of other technology challenges, I think digital poverty's pretty much gone on the radar. So the type of thing we're scratching on the surface of is where access to computer rooms, student computing rooms, and the power of the Janet network, staff and students have struggled to carry on as normal. And this was made worse because security requirements, certain requirements such as hardware, was maybe inaccessible. So through some aspects of investment were needed for at local government level. So what this session considers is what we can do to make access to our systems more affordable and effective in low bandwidth situations where low-end hardware is not necessarily available for high-end work. So we've got speakers from Strathclyde University today, Nottingham University, the Arts of London, and that leads into our next speaker, Mark O'Leary, the head of network access at JISC. And Mark, if you want to maybe come forward, switch on your camera. Mark's going to be introducing leading as far as our speakers are concerned, the challenges of addressing digital poverty at a national scale. So Mark, welcome you, ask you to obviously come forward. Welcome, Mark. You're going to be our first speaker. Over to yourself.
Great. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you all. Let me just find a set of slides to present, which I hope you should be seeing now.
They're coming through fine, yes.
Excellent. So I'm here really to address one of the three sort of legs of the digital poverty tripod, which I at least take to be connectivity, access to devices, and access to the appropriate digital skills and training. I'm going to talk connectivity. So I'll be presenting what JISC has been doing in the connectivity space specifically. I'm sure other colleagues within JISC have been making strides in areas like licensing of content and training and so on. So without further ado, I think I just wanted to start with some sort of back of envelope thoughts about what the scale of the problem actually is. So something coming on towards 700,000 FE students in 1920. 16% of those claimed free school meals, and that's probably one of the better measures that we've managed to find to determine whether they might be in this digital poverty category. The picture in HE article from The Guardian here reported some 26,000 students from disadvantaged backgrounds, again in 2019. The first quintile there is about 12,000 students. I imagine that the pattern is about 30, 40, 50,000 students from FE. So we're talking somewhere into the 75 to 100,000 students probably in this current year, falling into a broad definition of economically disadvantaged and therefore subject to digital poverty. Again, from this Guardian article, they were able to spot the pattern that the majority of these students in England, at least, are based in major urban centres. And again, a bit of back of envelope thinking. There are figures out there from various bodies that lead to the conclusion that about a quarter of these are living in homes of multiple occupancy with broadband included in the rent. So that cuts down the size of the problem cohort. Those that do have to pay for rent separately but are living in a multiple occupancy private landlord accommodation. If you look at, I guess, the mid to low end of the current broadband market and assume that it's fairly shared across that multiple occupancy household, then they may actually be getting decent sort of DSL-based broadband for a contribution that's less than £10 a month. I'm not saying this as a claim that the digital poverty category does not exist, but I guess it's setting a benchmark of the kind of financial implications we have to beat in any intervention we make to try and assist these students further. So there are far more comprehensive analyses of these issues out there. These were just a few figures that I was able to turn up, and interesting. Why do we need to affect this at all? Why is it important? General unemployment has a far bigger impact on recent graduates than it does on the population as a whole. And we've seen that COVID has had a huge impact on levels of general unemployment and specifically on entry-level jobs and the availability of part-time jobs, all things that hurt students currently supporting their own education or recent graduates looking to move into full employment. And the other big factor brought into focus by COVID, but present with us and growing well before that, was a general move to a blended learning model, where we see this AOC survey pointed out that under 19 students are now picking up more than half of their learning hours as remote study. And the data required to do that costs them money in most cases. And that causes a hardship. And you can see that reflected in the increased draw on bursaries and hardship funds around educational organisations in England. So there's a problem there to address. We can do something meaningful for quite a large number of students who are in financial hardship directly arising from their commitment to taking further education. But the trick is getting that intervention right and hitting the right level and the right way to reach the right people. So the rest of my talk will be touching on what we at JISC have tried to do in that space, with mixed success, as you will see. So one of the early things we looked at was, could we put a mobile SIM out onto the market, specifically targeted and giving the sort of right size of data for a very, very competitive cost. And our investigations there suggested there's a minimum number of subscribers to hit there. There's certainly enough target students to meet that number, but to actually reach them will probably cost a lot in marketing. The typical data plan from a mobile provider rests on the assumption that the vast majority of their customers will use significantly less than the advertised bandwidth allowance. So a typical 10 gig plan on the high street market, they would assume an average of about 6 gig of usage. But we would suspect that disadvantaged learners would push harder on those limits. And the big factor is bad debt rates. Product designs for SIM services live and die on what your target market are like in terms of paying their bills. And unfortunately, students and the military share the honor of being the worst people to sell mobile data to. So it's hard to find delivery partners to do these sorts of things. Could just do it all ourselves. We don't want to become a public carrier. The costs of hiring the legal teams and the support teams and so on to do that would be prohibitive. So we would be looking at some sort of partnership to deliver a data-only SIM, and that immediately limits its usefulness because you either have to have a dual SIM handset, which is a very rare thing, or you ask the learners to actually swap SIMs every time they settle down to study, which is far from ideal, or we limit them to just using tablets that have a SIM slot. If we are partnering with a single provider, their coverage is going to be spotty. And then you get into issues of democratic access. And if one student on a given course has really good coverage from our partner, and the one they sit next to during that course has no coverage at all in the house that they're renting, and has far better coverage from a different provider, but one that isn't part of the scheme, it starts to look very unfair. One way around this is to exploit international roaming to UK coverage providers, and international, you can qualify for those roaming arrangements under some special definitions of overseas that include firms based out of the Channel Islands, for example. But just by nature of being a roaming product, there's a premium tariff applied. So another way at this might be trying to set up a national procurement framework for local solutions. But then again, the easy to serve, low cost urban students would probably find that their home organizations find it easy to procure a partner to deliver to them. Expensive rural customers might not get any bids at all into the framework. So there's a number of problems with trying to deliver a SIM, and there are some relatively affordable SIMs out there, not this sort of perfect student aimed design. But let's move on from the SIM product. Excuse me. So can JISC intervene in the home broadband market and drive the cost down? First idea there is we have a national backbone. Could we not build a universal broadband service for education? And the answer is, of course, we could. But that's probably implying converting about 1,000 exchanges at an estimated cost of 80 million. And we can't really pass on a lot of the savings of starting from having Janet at the core, because that runs into state aid issues. JISC as a company doesn't have teams of men in vans to go out and dig fiber runs and street level circuits. We don't have the huge legal team required to manage wayleaves. That's a massive overhead for broadband providers. And we don't have a tailored end user support system either, all high costs to bring in. So the alternative looks like white labeling from an incumbent provider, but they probably already offer a broadband service over their own infrastructure. So if we're buying that infrastructure from them at a margin, even if we're buying in bulk, there's no way we're going to be able to compete on price with whatever their offering is. So there doesn't seem to be much value add in just getting involved in that transaction. Another thing we considered looking at is actually buying out completely an existing national provider, probably at the smaller end of the market. That would take us into that market fully with all of those overheads, but we would presumably be taking on the contracts of the existing staff there to do that. Just the capex to get that done is again over 10 million, we think. Other things we could do, make it easy to identify learners to qualify for discounts. Were the existing providers looking for ways to offer discounts to students, which they aren't necessarily doing? Another thing we could do is run some sort of local market comparison tool to help people find the best deals and get the usual sort of Meerkat-based kickback for referrals. But again, we have no special skills in that area or market insight, so that wasn't felt to be a successful intervention either. So we can't do cheaper broadband. Can we do a different kind of broadband that's better for learners? There is a solution here, domestic broadband, as I say on the slide, asymmetric, highly contended, particularly outside work hours. But ideally a learner would want symmetric flows and low contention. And that sounds a lot like business broadband. But business broadband is typically offered at a premium by providers compared to domestic. And it tends towards longer contract lengths, whereas the best student-friendly broadband contracts are 9-month or rolling, so that they can fit in with term times and with rental contracts with landlords. So it doesn't seem that we can sort of leverage business broadband to bring around a better learner broadband. And it doesn't seem to us that there's new technology that could transform this market, with the caveat that always lurking is 5G. 5G is very much a hyped technology. It does have some unique characteristics that can be very useful in the education market, I think. I don't think it's there yet. Where we are today, it's still centered in urban areas, and it very much has the cachet of a premium product, and the devices that can actually make use of it are the high-end sort of designer fashion statement phones and watches and laptops. Under the hood of the 5G that you can buy on the high street, it's actually tweaked a little bit to favor a mobile use case. And it's not really great as a broadband replacement, particularly for sort of domestic broadband using 5G instead. It's much more optimized for bursty flows. So something like sustained participation in a video conference like this is not ideally suited to a 5G use case. Where we do get a lot of media push for 5G is coming from the States, but the licensing regime there is very different. I think I'm right in saying that licensing for Ofcom for private 5G at the moment is really under the heading of kind of trial licenses. So you might find yourself investing in a lot of hardware infrastructure with no guarantee that a short-term trial license would be renewable. So can GIST do anything about that? And unless there's a major turnaround in the world and we get granted a block of spectrum and similar amounts of money to those discussed on the previous slide, we'd be limited again to becoming the sort of Tesco's mobile of the education world and white labeling someone else's mobile network, with exactly the same issues if we wouldn't be able to outcompete that provider's product. And even where we're supporting users with new devices to make use of connectivity, those probably aren't going to be high-end 5G ones. So one initiative that we put a lot of work into was this concept of zero rating. So you may already have seen telecoms providers either offering vouchers to their local councils or to educational institutions to pass on for Wi-Fi access to their disadvantaged students, or indeed there have been sales of vouchers to the government. But these were largely fairly small-scale gestures. The firms themselves quite publicly did some interventions in education during lockdown to show them doing their bits, and you may have seen zero rating of access to BBC Bitesize, for example, or the Oak Academy. But that doesn't work for FE and HE. The typical student has to visit a lot of resources that don't all end in AC UK in order to complete their studies. So this has been done by telcos. In the mobile broadband space, it's not as easy to do in fixed home broadband the way it's been deployed in the UK market. We've seen, for example, free social media as a selling point to teenagers of a particular mobile plan. So it's possible. JISC helped lobby for this sort of initiative, both in England and Scotland, and I think it actually took place in Republic of Ireland a little ahead of us. But we very rapidly found that we couldn't provide the telecoms providers with a meaningful list of resources to put into a filter, and they weren't really amenable to having a very large filter that every traffic flow would have to be checked against. So we did have a proposal to launch a national VPN concentrator on Janet. So that would be a single address range that all learners' traffic would go through if they were conducting sort of educational work and studies. There was an obvious product to look at for this, EduVPN, which is an open source product that's been developed by Géant to be fit for the education market. Unfortunately, we find that that doesn't scale very well as a national solution. It's very good for an individual organization, but big problems crop up if you try to go bigger. So yeah, zero rating did not proceed. So we then got to the intervention that we've actually had some success with. This is working on Eduroam. I trust you're all familiar with the Eduroam service. Its sister service of GovRoam is targeted at the wider public sector, and we've made some headway in getting local authorities in particular to adopt GovRoam. And we have 71 local authorities that currently deploy that service. And it was felt that sites that had deployed GovRoam would be extremely familiar with the requirements of Eduroam, as they are identical, and they would be the lowest hanging fruit to try and get the Eduroam footprint boosted among local authority venues. And we engaged in a bit of lobbying with the Department for Education, and very kindly the Universities Minister supported us and sent a letter to all of these 71 local authorities we were targeting, and we engaged with the Local Government Association, and they gave us very kind backing as well. That started off in April. We did a bit of briefing around what was going on. The letter finally landed in mid-May, and we started publicising that this was going on. You may have seen coverage in the media. What did we actually achieve? I would have to say, to date, it's more of a slow burn. Since I wrote these slides, these numbers have ticked up a bit. We've had inquiries from 25 of those 71 local authorities about what's involved in signing up for EduRoam, and 5 of those have completed and deployed EduRoam coverage across their estate. So a learner living at home perhaps can find free at point of use connectivity at their public library or a sports centre or government office or in public plaza type areas while the weather's good. This activity has shone a light on this area, and other groups have got involved in pushing this programme further, notably Kent and North Yorkshire, the PSN bodies there who are continuing the promotion push with their local authority members. And NINET was also just in the process of launching a general public Wi-Fi in the towns of their region. And on the strength of this, they added EduRoam and GovRoam to the footprint of that, and actually found on launch that some 30% of the traffic they saw over the network was coming from EduRoam logins. So just to round up, I feel like I've cantered through and done scant justice to a number of colleagues who've been working very hard on this to the background, but it's a difficult nut to crack. Trying to bring in commercial partners, they justifiably need to see a benefit to their business in joining any of these programs, possibly above and beyond that of just getting some transient publicity. That has generally translated into a desire for exclusivity in any partnership they would form with JISC. And for the reasons of sort of spotty geographical coverage that I mentioned before, that makes it very difficult to go ahead, because we can't offer it fairly to all the students. And obviously they don't want to give a benefit to their competitors by co-promoting them. Similarly, in the public sector, those public bodies are working to very straitened budgets and to quite a distant planning horizon. They've got long-term plans, and suddenly appearing with a complex network implementation and putting some pressure on them to deliver that and to fund it themselves is a hard ask. And I'm very pleased with the response we have had from the local authorities looking at EduRoam, and I'm hoping that that will be sustained over a longer term as they find that funding and they find the gaps in their work programme to address the ask. There are a few things JISC could have assayed to affect the market for the digitally disadvantaged, but some of the ideas we had would make JISC itself into a very different beast, and perhaps make it harder for us to continue to provide the service we do to the education sector, which is after all our core mission. And most of our ideas, you couldn't fault us for not being ambitious. We would need a really significant government initiative to fund them. What we have managed to do is to continue to serve as a neutral advisor, particularly between the government and the telecoms market, where there's been a number of meetings on various interventions that could be made. What we can do, we're playing to our strengths, and the initiative around EduRoam being at the forefront of those. Our pressure keeps the issue alive, and I'm pleased to say just recently JISC has been invited to join the all-party parliamentary group on digital poverty, and we will continue lobbying from that position and through all the contacts we have. And lastly, at opportunities like this, I and my colleagues can call on you to keep this issue alive with your local contacts, and also to come back to us with your ideas and your examples of best practice. we would love to hear from you, and if there's something good out there that we can add value to, we stand ready to throw our support behind it. So that finishes what I wanted to say today. Thank you for your attention, and if there are any questions.
Thank you, Mark. That's some fantastic content that you've covered, some fantastic information that you've actually run through. It's amazing what JISC are obviously doing at a local level, at a national level. It's just one of those tools that will just aid the topic in terms of digital poverty. So some really great work JISC actually doing. I think some of the publications were put in the chat. We've had a couple of questions that have actually come in. Ideally, I'll probably maybe go over to those who are posing the questions and ask if you'd like to switch on your camera. I've got Ahmed and Bruce have put a couple of questions into the chat. If you want to switch on your camera, maybe come forward. I can happily read out the questions on your behalf.
Hi, Mark.
Bruce.
It's Bruce here at Strathclyde.
Hello again, Bruce.
If a local authority wanted to deploy Eduroam, what's the cost implication? Is there a charge from JISC to the local authority?
Right, so a local authority deploying Eduroam would offer it on a visitor-only basis because they don't qualify for the full membership, not being sort of engaged in the business of education, and all the visitor-only deployments of Eduroam are completely free of charge.
Okay, that's good to know.
Because they're doing us the favour of expanding our footprint. In the particular exercise we've been doing, we've targeted local authorities that have already deployed GovRoam, which is the knockoff copy of Eduroam that's completely tailored for the wider public sector, and they do pay a modest subscription to be part of that, but they get the full access and can offer accounts to their staff to get the roaming benefit as well as offering the guest services. But yeah, Eduroam on its own, and you don't have to have GovRoam to deploy Eduroam as a local authority. That would be completely free of charge, and we're happy to.
That's good to know. Just trying to make sure there's no stumbling blocks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bruce. Yeah, thank you, Mark. I can ask Ahmed's question on his behalf. Ahmed, did you want to come forward in relation to NHS Roam?
No, feel free, Jason, to go ask him.
Yeah. So, Mark, in essence, I guess, does NHS Roam use the same technology too?
It's an interesting question, largely because I'm not really aware of NHS Roam. GovRoam is our federated roaming product that is very much aimed at NHS trusts. They're actually the dominant users of GovRoam. Something like 46% of the organisations registered in subscribing to GovRoam are health trusts, hospitals, and so on. So GovRoam is the dominant service there. I know there are a few trusts that have done a local solution, either because of not sure whether to go with GovRoam or the dichotomy of perhaps looking at GovWiFi as an alternative federated roaming solution. They've done a local solution, and it may be NHS Roam is one of these. To give a little insight to the people on this call, and just between the two of us, as it were, we are talking with NHS Digital about ways to bring a much larger slice of NHS in England into the GovRoam family in one hit. That's far from concluded yet, so watch this space.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. Esther's put a very interesting comment into the chat. Esther, I'm encouraging you. Maybe did you want to come forward and share the works that your area is working on at the moment? Welcome, Esther. Thank you.
Hi, no worries at all. Yeah, just as I say, building on Mark's work and the JISC team's work, we have a group of chief executives of national research and education networks across the world, and we spoke about this issue a couple of weeks ago, and what we could do. As Mark said, digital inequity is a very hard nut to crack, but there must be some leverage we can have globally as well. We're at a very early stage. We've learned a lot from some work that we've done in Africa, yeah, just watch this space, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you, Esther. Yeah, thank you for sharing, and very much it's evolving topic as we move this forward, particularly what tools can we have that will aid us in moving this forward. Yeah. So just to thank Mark one more time for the presentation that he has covered. If you can share your round of applause, by all means, continue to put the questions in the chat. Actually, it's going to move us forward to our next speaker, Dr. Stephanie McKendry and Andrew Cooper from Strathclyde, the University of Strathclyde. All of our speakers will be hanging around, and you can potentially catch them as we move into at the end of today's session in terms of comments, conversations. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Stephanie and Andrew, who are going to cover mitigating digital poverty. Over to you.
Great, thank you, Jason. I'll just share my slides if I can.
Yeah, that's coming through fine, Stephanie.
Great.
We can see that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Brilliant. So what we're talking about is the approach at an institutional level. So we're going to talk through what we were doing in terms of student computing pre-COVID, and then what we did as a result of reacting to it. Just to give you a bit of background on the institution, the University of Strathclyde in the very city centre of Glasgow, in quite a large campus. We're a large university, and we describe ourselves as a leading international technological university. And what's really key to Strathclyde is that we deliver what we do in a socially progressive way. So I'm the head of access, equality and inclusion. So obviously my role is very much about widening access and getting people from underrepresented or disadvantaged groups into and through university. And that really is a strategic priority for us. We give ourselves a 2020 target for a number of entrants from disadvantaged backgrounds and met those 3 years ahead of schedule. So we've now committed by 2025 that we will have 1,300 entrants annually from the 40% most deprived areas in Scotland. And we've met the Scottish Government's access targets for 2030 this year. So we're making great progress in terms of getting people in, but we're obviously really concerned the impact of COVID, particularly in terms of digital exclusion. I'll pass over to Andrew, who's going to talk a little bit about student computing beforehand.
Thanks, Steph, and apologies because we're going to do this in Chris Whitty style because I don't have control, so I'll have to say next slide, please, whenever we need to move the slides forward. But yeah, at Strathclyde, like many universities, we ran student computing in the same way that we've done for a long time. This PC is not indicative of the PCs that we have on desks just now. Some of the desks maybe not that far off these, but this is a PC from the mid-90s. And in the mid-90s, when we did student computing, we put PCs like this on desks in rooms. And if students wanted to access IT, they had to go to the room, sit down, and log into the PC. 25 years later, that's still the dominant way of accessing IT in our university, or it was before the pandemic. If you can move the slide forward, Steph. The next, this slide shows one of our labs from around about February last year. So you can see the base units are underneath the desks now, but it's very much the same. If you were a student in the mid-90s and you had left university in the mid-90s and walked into one of these rooms, the monitors are now flat. The mice have optical mice instead of trackballs, but it's pretty much the same way you would access IT, which obviously gives us a problem because the way people consume and use IT has changed dramatically since the mid-90s. When I was a student, if I had to get my exam results, I'd go to the lecturer's room and he'd put a printout of the results outside his room. Obviously, things have changed, you consume them digitally now. So if these labs were shut, then we have a problem. We have tried to address that up until the start of the pandemic by extending access, putting more machines in so more people can access the machines, and opening facilities for longer. Some facilities open 24 hours a day. Obviously, this breaks down when you have to shut all of the facilities. And this had a big effect on teaching because as a technological university, where our academics pride themselves on not just giving an excellent academic degree, they teach the students the applications and the packages they will need throughout their career. So when they leave university, they can just walk into a job and they already know the industry standard software suite. So if we can't deliver those applications to the students, their degree is in a way diminished. So as soon as we had lockdown and we had to close these labs, we had a major problem. We could not deliver these applications to our students. And it caused us quite a lot of head scratching. How do we deliver these applications, desktops, environments securely and at speed so that people could access them? And there's a number of solutions on the market. There's solutions that virtualize the applications so that you can deploy just the applications themselves locally to a machine. But we had to dismiss that because we had a high number of Mac users. So if we tried to deploy a Windows application to a Macintosh, you'd need some sort of additional environment on top. We looked at opening up remote access to these labs. Turning on remote desktop access to these very desktops. But we weren't entirely convinced the licensing would allow us to do that. So it was quite a happy coincidence that at the time Microsoft were pushing their Windows Virtual Desktop product, which is now rebranded as Azure Virtual Desktop. So we went down that route. We set up a Windows Virtual Desktop environment, installed as many applications as we could, and we deployed it. And if you could go to the next slide. So that meant that we could deploy desktops and applications to any device, no matter where you were. And this, I felt at the time, was transformational. It means it doesn't matter what device you have, you'll have the same experience. If you can afford a more powerful device, it doesn't give you an advantage because the compute happens in the cloud. If you have a lower powered device, you're not at a disadvantage because all the compute happens in the cloud. Everybody has the same experience. It democratizes the IT experience. And that's fantastic. And I won't go into any more detail on how we implemented this. There's another talk on virtual desktops later. But the biggest problem that we had was not everybody had a device. So I'll pass back to Steph.
Thanks, Andrew. So yeah, we knew that a lot of our students didn't have their own devices and that digital poverty was an issue pre-pandemic, but it truly came to the fore, I'm sure, for every institution at that time. And as Mark said earlier, there's a lot of evidence about how many people suffer digital exclusion and who. I've just got two reports I'd like to point to. So the one by Nesta explored data poverty in Scotland and Wales in particular. And that report found that 1 in 7 adults experience data poverty, that data poverty widens existing inequalities, and that disadvantaged groups experience digital exclusion to a greater extent. So I don't think that's necessarily surprising, but it's good to have the kind of firm evidence for that. Our own organisation within Strathclyde, Celsius, also looked at digital challenges for care experienced young people in particular. So they're often a group that are the least likely to access higher education. And so it's particularly important in this setting. SELF is taught to all local authorities within Scotland for their experiences about digital exclusion prior to COVID and what had happened afterwards. And unsurprisingly, what they found was that things were more massively exacerbated. So the report noted that there was a lack of access to hardware, which included laptops, but also phones, that there was a lack of consistent, reliable access to broadband and Wi-Fi, and that for some young people, there were also gaps in digital literacy or confidence. And they concluded that most care experienced young people survive on pretty limited income anyway, and many are living in poverty. So that meant they often lack the funds for laptops or tablets or smartphones. That digital poverty will be experienced within the student cohort as much as anywhere else. And given the need for online and blended learning, that has serious repercussions. So we were really concerned that all of that work we'd undertaken to improve access and participation for disadvantaged groups might be undermined. So they were at university at the point of the pandemic, but were much less able to continue with their studies than their more affluent counterparts. So initially, we did what I'm sure many universities did, and really just scramble around trying to get hold of, to purchase laptops. We were able to get hold of some reconditioned ones, and by using faculty contacts, we were able to identify students that were really struggling to access their learning, and distributed those on a kind of first come first served basis. Over the summer, the following academic year, we were able to put together digital inclusion schemes that were much more targeted with specific criteria. In the intervening time, we'd received funding from the Scottish Funding Council, and that meant we were able to purchase a large supply of laptops. That funding came with conditions, one of which was that the university was to own the machines. So what we did was, for Scottish domiciled learners that were eligible for that funding, we introduced a laptop loan scheme. And so the laptop was managed and owned by the university, but it was the responsibility of the student, and they had sole and exclusive use of it for the duration of their studies. And this created restrictions, but I think when we look back on it, ultimately, that was a positive, that we were able to give people laptops rather than pots of money. I think it's quite hard if you're in a family where people are going hungry, there's losses of jobs, there's a lack of part-time jobs. It's quite difficult to justify spending money on a laptop, even when you're given a bit of funding specifically for that purpose. So we thought it was really useful that we were actually able to give people the machines. We were also able to purchase much higher spec machines than you would be able to do so within a consumer setting. So we had eligibility criteria that aimed to target the most disadvantaged. So it was if you were care experienced, you were a recipient of one of our widening access scholarships, or you were in receipt of the highest bursary from the Student Awards Agency Scotland, which is for those on the lowest family income bracket. We also put in a criteria that was for if you don't meet any of these eligibility criteria, but you have an exceptional need. So that meant that we could take things on a case-by-case basis. And I think there's a question there about what was uptake like. It was pretty high. So up to date, we've given out 445 laptops, and over 350 of those are from the laptop loan scheme in particular. We supplemented that with our own internal funding so that we could support students from the rest of the UK. And we did that by giving out grants of £500 if they needed a laptop. And then for everybody else, both Scottish students and our UK and international, we gave out Wi-Fi grants of £50. And this was for them to spend in whatever way was most suitable to get connectivity. So we offered advice on either increasing mobile contracts or buying dongles or whatever was going to be most useful for that particular circumstance. And I'll pass back to Andrew to talk about how we manage those laptops.
Yeah, so when we got in, or when Steph's team got in touch with us, we had a choice to make with these laptops. We could give them the laptop straight out of the box as if they bought them from a high street retailer, and let them get on with it with support from our support teams, or we could configure them in a managed way, so that they were more like the sort of machines they would experience in the university. And there was quite a lot of internal debate as to what would the best model be. The arguments for the sort of the high street model was it's more flexible. If we manage the device, we kind of have to adhere to cyber essentials. So they wouldn't be administrator of the device. They wouldn't be able to install certain things without asking. So it was felt maybe a managed device was not suitable. But in the end, we went with a managed device, and for a number of reasons. Firstly, our support teams were really struggling with COVID. We had so many calls in, we had our help desk was swamped. So to add to that burden with people, how do I install Office? How do I configure OneDrive? If we could take those questions away from our help desk, that would help. Second of all, because of the way that these were funded, they're technically owned by the university. So we kind of need to manage these devices. But more importantly than that, because we're giving to the students, we kind of have a duty of care to make sure that the work that they do is safe. So we want to make sure that if they spend 2 weeks writing their dissertation, it's backed up. If we've provided a device to them, they would have an expectation that we would help protect their data. So we decided to manage the devices. If we can move on to the next slide. So how did we do this? How did we deploy this? So we had a couple of options. Our experience was in Configuration Manager, Microsoft Configuration Manager, imaging devices, the same sort of deployment technologies that have been used for decades. And we looked at that and we quickly ruled that out for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's intensive. It does require technical staff to do some work, which we were struggling to get the staff. But second of all, at the time, no one was really sure how transmissible COVID was on devices. So we thought if we get a device shipped to us and we unbox it and we configure it, we then have to quarantine that device before we then send it to the user. And there was a need to get these into the students' hands as soon as possible. So we thought maybe that might not be the best way forward. So we decided to use Microsoft Intune instead, with one of the companion technologies to that called Autopilot. This allowed us to ship devices directly to students from the vendor, and they were self-provisioning. The setup of that, we had no experience in Intune before we started this, and my team is very small. There's 2 of us, so we managed to do this in addition to our additional work. I know my boss is on the call, so I'm going to say it was really, really difficult, but it was actually quite straightforward in a way. You configure the Intune portal to deliver certain configuration profiles. I want Office installed. I want 7-zip Adobe Reader installed. I want to configure OneDrive to connect to our university OneDrive. And then you target them to a profile, to a device. So what we did was we ordered devices from HP, who are in Scotland. There's a Scottish framework where we buy HP laptops. HP sent us the serial numbers and the device hashes, which are required for Autopilot to work. We then imported them into the Microsoft Intune portal. And that was pretty much it. The device got shipped to the user. They opened it up, connected it to Wi-Fi, log in with their email address, and it provisions itself as if it was one of our lab machines. And within about half an hour, they would have Office installed, licensed, their OneDrive synchronizing, it would be fully functional. The only caveat that we had that was different from what we did before was we had to buy these devices with Windows 10 Professional. Windows 10 Home, which you can buy to lessen the cost of the devices, that doesn't have the hooks to hook into the autopilot process. So we had to spend about £10 per device more so that this process functioned. But we thought that was worth it. So we went down this route. And the way that we've configured the devices is that if I'm a student and I save my documents to my documents folder, they're synchronized to OneDrive. If I save them to the desktop, they're synchronized to OneDrive. If I bookmark things, it's synchronized to the cloud. If I move back to campus, and as we've opened up campus, there are labs open, it's the same synchronizations. So I can leave my laptop in the house, I come in to sit down at a lab machine, I synchronize my documents that I had on my desktop in the house. I synchronized my bookmarks, everything seamlessly moves with you. And it also means if the device is lost or stolen, it's much like if you were to lose a smartphone, provided you use the cloud backup, you get your new device, you log in, and all of your settings and configurations stream back down. So it was a very powerful way to deliver an environment which was tailored to our students' needs, that would address their needs virtually instantly as soon as they got them. Much better than we could have done with using older technologies. Go to the next slide, Steph. Obviously, that device would allow them to do the administrative tasks that they might want to do. So engage with their tutors, engage with funding bodies, the sort of things that they couldn't do these days. Back in my day, I'd send a letter off to somebody. I'd turn up at somebody's office for an interview. Obviously now you don't do that. So it allows them to access those functions. It also allows them to access the virtual desktop that we set up previously. But we also deployed applications through our company portal, which is the application catalog you get with Microsoft Intune. So they can self-serve certain applications, not all of them, but they can download locally applications to the device if they need to access them locally. So we came up with this solution very, very quickly, and it was really quite straightforward to deploy. And we're going to use that for more devices. So it had an added benefit for the organization as well. But Steph, I think, will be talking about the feedback that we've had from the students.
Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, so we conducted, my team conducted an evaluation survey with those students who had the laptop loans, and the response was really high. We had 30, I think it was 36% of those who had received the loan responded to the survey, and it was all really positive. So you can see there, 91% found the laptops really useful, and a lot of them said that they wouldn't have managed with it without it. I think we learned, because they were submitting forms to us that were outlining why they needed the devices and what they could gain from them, we learned an awful lot about student situations that perhaps we had an idea of, but not quite the extent. So what we found was that so many students were in maybe multi-generational households where you've got a grandparent, a parent, and children all using the one device. And during school lockdown, and when school children are learning from home, that was almost impossible. We were also surprised at how many students were maybe in the later years of their degree, third and fourth year, studying things like engineering and computer science, and they'd managed just by using the university's labs and local libraries up to that point. So we really filled a gap that just there would be no other solution for. And I'll just end with some of the quotes that we got from our students. There was, and I know one of the questions was about uptake. We certainly did have conversations with students where they said, "Can I not have the money instead?" You can totally understand that. But by and large, when we explained it's a condition of funding, it's a brand new laptop, and you will have it for as long as you need it. That assuaged a lot of the concerns. So I'll stop there, but we're happy to take any questions.
Stephanie, Andrew, just want to thank you for the amazing content. That actually hits right at the heart of today's theme in terms of digital poverty, and some amazing work actually being done. There are some questions coming in. Just to probably backpedal, today's session is being recorded and the content will be made available via the ucisa repository thereafter. I'm going to jump straight into the questions. I'll probably do them in order, and the way I'm seeing some of the names appearing on my screen, I'm assuming it was Roger Bruce as opposed to Bruce Roger, which is the reverse. I'm seeing it. Julie, I'll probably ask you. Sorry, let me go back as far as Marion Malcolm, who made a comment in relation to Aberdeen University. I think Roger Bruce was surely praising the work that was actually done and commending the team's effort. Marion Malcolm, did you want to come forward, maybe pose your question? Just share.
Yeah, I think thanks very much to Stephanie and Andrew. That was really interesting. You have already answered that, and Juliet, and also Bruce Rogers saying it's Bruce Roger, not Roger Bruce.
Apologies. It's
Bruce Rogers. Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, we had so it was good to see you got a really high uptake, because once our lot were told they weren't getting it, they were like, I don't want it then, which was a bit of a surprise to us. And even though it was explained, it's a loan, you can use it forever. What we ended up doing was, actually, if somebody needed a loan of something for 2 or 3 weeks until they either bought something new, or, for example, if they had a problem, that's actually what we did with them. But it wasn't that many, but it was a huge surprise to us that there wasn't a higher uptake.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm going to move on in terms of questions. Andy Rowling was asking about cost. Andy, did you want to come forward? Maybe just I guess, Stephanie, the question posed was, isn't AVD very expensive? I guess the virtual desktop. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it surprised us. So if you think when you're trying to plan these deployments, you think, well, we have at Strathclyde, we've got over 20,000 students. So to provision that in the cloud, if you were to provision it for all 20,000, it would be outrageously expensive. What we found was the concurrency wasn't very high. So students would connect at various times of the day. So we might have a peak concurrency of 300 or so of our 20,000 students. So it wasn't that expensive, provided you scale it correctly. Our costings were, initially, our initial funding was kind of pinched from the lab replacement budget, because why bother replacing the labs that year, because nobody was in. And over 12 months, we spent under half of that lab replacement budget on the entirety of the Azure Virtual Desktop. So it's actually saved us money on the normal refresh costs that we would spend on endpoints for the students. And that was with us not really knowing what we were doing. There's scaling tools that you can get that will aggressively scale things, so it will be cheaper. The key thing for the Azure Virtual Desktop compared to other offerings is the licensing. Provided you're licensed for Office 365 for your users, they have a license to connect, which is not the case if you're running on-prem. If it's a personally owned device, you have to have a CAL, so that adds significantly to the cost. But for us, it was great, no licensing headaches, and because it's the cloud, you can try it. If it costs too much, just turn it off.
Yeah, great stuff. We Greenwich, the University of Greenwich, on that journey in terms of Intune, Microsoft's Intune, and as far as things go. So I guess in terms of contact thereafter, as far as the community is concerned, I guess a massive appreciation from sharing your journey thus far, and obviously I guess from a community's perspective, if there are questions thereafter and following up thereafter. I've got Chris has just posted in the chat. We found exactly the same thing. It brings us probably to a nice point in terms of break. If there are any questions, by all means, just raise your hand. The chat's moving just probably a little faster than I was keeping pace with. So if I've missed anyone, please feel free to raise your hand and just come forward. Just one last appreciation for Stephanie and Andrew for the fantastic content that they've covered just before we obviously move into the comfort break, the coffee break. All right, so that takes us into the comfort break as far as today's session is concerned. We have got a 10-minute coffee break, comfort break. Our next speaker will start back at actually 2:10, so 5-minute comfort break. Feel free to use this partly as a networking session. If you did have any comments, conversation, questions that you did actually want to pose, we will obviously be commencing at 2:10 with Lisa Foster in terms of responding to digital poverty. So thank you. Julian, you have raised your hand. Feel free to come forward, please. Switch on your camera, unmute your microphone, come forward and join us.
My question's been answered.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much.
There's a misunderstanding over 3-letter acronyms, which I fully understand. Yeah, no, I was just thinking about this because where Goldsmiths is going through this as well. So I was just wondering what the impact would be on the future refresh, not the current refresh, but the future lab refreshes.
Yes.
Answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite happy to talk about that. Yeah, we are looking at potentially not refreshing the machines as we used to, because a lot of our students require engineering applications. We need to buy high-end machines everywhere because we're not sure where they're going to sit down. So all machines have to be able to run MATLAB, Autodesk, that sort of thing. With running things in the cloud, we can now potentially buy thin clients. We can sweat the assets for longer, so they don't have to be the latest, because we know that the compute is delivered from the cloud. And if you are studying engineering, we can deliver you a GPU-enabled desktop that would be probably far better than a device that we could buy for the desk, to be honest. So it can change.
Are you thinking about the underlying hardware as well? Are you actually moving that to being an internet-first connection, or are you?
We've not made any decisions yet. We are thinking along those lines. It's at the moment, because we've run it for the last academic year, it's worked well. There are some headaches around licensing for certain products, which hopefully we can square. There are some issues with performance for one of the applications. We use a multi-user version of Windows, so when you have more than one user using the device at the same time, some applications are poorly written and write to the same area, so it thinks there's more than one copy of the application running.
Really useful as well, and we've struggled with the same challenges, some of these licensing challenges, but ucisa there is now a sort of mainstream purchasing type group, and it might be worth feeding sort of information back in, because these are things that potentially could be negotiated for education as a whole. Because I think we've all got the same challenges. You know, when they license it, so it has to be locked to an IP address, it stops all sorts of ways of working. You know, so it'd be really good if, as an industry, we negotiated with these suppliers to get maybe education-specific licensing that doesn't cause these problems.
I think very much, Trevor, and thank you, Andrew, for commenting and answering what Julian raised. I think very much as a body, particularly what the user community is doing, the direction of travel. You know, thin clients were being mentioned previously, cloud, but the direction of travel and how we as a community can pull together and harness the power of what we've got is very much an opportunity. Yes.
Especially with Microsoft Cloud PC on the horizon, which looks to put similar facilities into, you know, public hands, as it were. You might see this becoming a more familiar sort of thing, but we still want to be able to empower students that choose to use that platform. So the license has to match. You know, it has to be, you're a student, therefore you can use, basically.
Yeah, there's certain catalogs and repositories that we've had issues with where they use IP restrictions to prove that you're coming from a university to access their catalogue. If you're remote, if you're using one of our laptops, if you're using a virtual desktop that's sitting in a data center which is hundreds of miles from you, that's really hard to prove that you are who you are. So it's a technology, they're using a technology from 20 years ago to authenticate where you're coming from, where understandably it works. As an industry, I think a lot of people are quite resistant to change on these things.
It's breaking their license, though, isn't it? So they could decide to get interested and charge you money for that. So it's down to them to kind of relook at their licensing for the modern world. Anyway, I think I'm taking out the next section now. So
I was going to say we're potentially. I'll just draw just before we start back up and start with our next speaker. I'll just probably draw maybe aimed at yourself, Andrew. Chris Parry's comment in terms of geographical restriction. It may have related to licensing. Could also apply to hardware as well. Just any comments before I bring Lisa Foster forward. Lisa, if you're with us, if you want to come forward, maybe switch on your camera. Chris, did you have any remaining comments, just closing comments, just as we move? Sorry, Andrew.
No,
yeah, Andrew, did you have any closing comments for Chris's question? Well,
about restrictions, yeah, that's the only thing that we're really seeing an issue with was the catalogs, those sorts of things that assume you're coming from the IP address range of your organisation, because obviously you're not. So we've had to come up with workarounds for those. But aside from that, it's worked really well.
Fantastic feedback. Yeah.
Yeah. So
really interesting.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you. Fantastic info. This leads into Lisa Foster, the Associate Director of IT Services at the University of Arts London. We've touched briefly into your time, but we'll clearly allow a couple of extra minutes at the end. Lisa, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to yourself. Over to you.
Can I just check that you're seeing the presentation view?
Not in presentation mode. Yes, yeah, it's in presentation mode now. Yes, over to you, Lisa. It's coming through perfectly.
Thank you. I can honestly work PowerPoint normally, but I've had some Wi-Fi problems, so I've had to switch the device, and it's not as cooperative, I have to say. Hang on, I've done exactly what I did yesterday and start at the end as well, so bear with me.
That's great. That's back at the beginning. Yes.
Right. Okay. Right. Thanks, everyone. It's quite interesting to see this topic advertised for the first time. I was thinking, we've been talking a lot about this, so we've been doing similar things to colleagues. So once I saw the headings of the other presentations, I thought, well, I'll just take a little step backwards on this one and talk about the wider context of what digital poverty might mean to a predominantly arts institution, and an area where we're looking at really some quite high performance compute, where we've got people using different types of equipment as well. So it's not just about, do you have a laptop? So in terms of how we might define it, look at the Royal Society, It isn't really about the lack of skills, which sometimes, to be fair, applies more to academic staff than to their students. It's about how you interact with the digital world, and that's knowledge, it's skills, it's equipment, and it's environment. It can be a lot of things that obstruct our students. We found people, we've got the odd person who's living in a houseboat attempting to deliver teaching and learning. We've got people in shared homes with the rest of their family. We've experienced a lot of issues with the drop that comes in the afternoon when all the children come home and start using e-learning. So students can be affected not only by their own poverty, but also very much by the family around them. And that's one thing we've certainly been finding this year. So core digital infrastructure, we are heavily dependent on people being able to come to our campus because that's where we reside. That's very much where they create art and collaborate. And we prize very highly people being together in workshops and studios and working together and exchanging ideas. So it's never really been an aspiration that we do this remotely and bring people in. So that core digital infrastructure has never really been outside our bounds. So starting to look into this became quite interesting. So to share some more figures with you, this survey run for the Office of Students says that 52% of students said the learning was impacted by slow or unreliable internet connection. I can understand what that's like. I had quite a panic earlier when Virgin Media unexpectedly played up. It plays up when it rains. So it's not even do they have a connection, but can they actually rely on it? 8% severely affected. That really came into play, particularly when we were looking at Chinese students. There's so many last mile issues that might affect a student. It really plays into support. If you can't really assume where they are and what they're doing it on, then the range of issues to support that student can be enormous. So it's frustrating on both sides. How can you support people to access when you've very little control of what they're actually accessing on? 71% of students talk about a lack of access to a quiet study space. We've certainly kept our libraries open throughout the COVID, except when we were actually required to close buildings, and students have really needed just that place to go where they can listen and partake of online learning and actually be able to hear it and respond to it and concentrate. So part of digital engagement is actually a space of your own where you can focus on that engagement. 56% of them lacked access to appropriate online course materials. Library, as usual, heroic in all of this with their focus on e-journals, e-resources, online training. But a lot of the time, this was still being delivered in paper. We've still got people making records of tutorial interviews in carbon copy. It just wasn't really there, that sense that we have a shared repository and people can access that wherever they are. It was still very much dependent on that face-to-face relationship. 18% of students in this survey were impacted by lack of access to a computer. And that's why I think all of us have been looking at virtual desktops of various sorts. We've been looking at how we can supply. So I think we've all got a pretty common experience in that way. So our provision at UAL, we're unusual just in the sheer quantity of sites. We have 6 colleges, they're spread over 13 sites, everywhere from Archway to Wimbledon, Mare Street to the Elephant and Castle and King's Cross, so it's a wide distribution. So in some ways our provision is therefore generous because we've got pockets of students who don't particularly move between sites. So we've got about 2,500 student computers in 140 spaces, including all the libraries, teaching rooms, open access areas. We have loan stores for cameras, digital cameras, sewing machines, CAD/CAM, all manner of activities that are beyond just a laptop or an access to a computer. Libraries, as I say, did really well out of this. They already had books and journals, they had training, they had a multitude of resources, they had the Lib Answers service, so they could engage in terms of reference inquiries. What our students in particular miss, because they're art students, they like to be able to come in and digitise full colour plates out of exhibition catalogues, textbooks, journals, and they weren't able to do that. They are very keenly aware of colour. and how that represents in the digital environment. So they certainly feel they've lost something there. Something as a non-artist I don't appreciate, but that has come up in our student forums, how much not being able to engage with a physical thing affects their perception of it as an artist. On digital access, our switchboard at the moment is staffed. We do some chat inquiries through our website. We do some web forms. And what we found with our artists is they are very visually engaged. What they don't do so well is read a whole load of complex information online, digest it, and then feel like engaging with a web form. Quite often they'll get through the first paragraph or so, and then they'll want to ring up and talk to someone. And we simply couldn't deal with that. So it's not necessarily digital poverty that stopped them engaging. It wasn't the fact that they didn't have equipment or broadband. It was the fact that there was just too much information in the wrong format. And they actually wanted human interaction. They wanted to talk to people. They wanted to have conversation. And we weren't able to provide that in this situation. That actually has impacted students, I think, more than we think. Our delivery, accordingly, was in person. Moodle was, as sometimes happens, a repository for PowerPoints and course materials, brochures. It suddenly became the conduit to collaborate for synchronous learning and for Panopto for our lecture capture. That had some issues. We found our suppliers didn't scale up as quickly as we did to be able to deal with the amount of students coming through. So that became problematic on a number of fronts, that it was sometimes not very clear which system was actually causing the problem, because the gateway system was getting blamed for the Collaborate issues. It was also a whole minefield for students to deal with. They are very visually attuned, and this whole elaborate daisy chain of systems and services was actually quite challenging for them to deal with. We also had an embarrassment of digital riches, because pretty much everybody hit the internet once and started suggesting useful tools to use. Way too confusing. So we did come down with quite a heavy hand early on that one, because we needed to invest the resources and effort we had into the right tools, not just any old tool or people's pet tools or things that they'd used before or things that looked shiny, that we had to be really careful that we weren't overwhelming people with just too much digital that's just beyond their ability to cope with. And we had a lot of advice and academic support in person. So that's where Teams came into its own. But if you're trying to discuss something quite sensitive with someone who maybe has broadband issues or who's trying to do this on their phone in a shared house, that became quite difficult. It had benefits for everyone in terms of immediacy, and it didn't involve having to work out when a room was available and when someone could come onto site and when they were free. But it could be quite difficult, again, in terms of the right kind of space that people needed to engage with that digital communication. So from our happy little environment on campus, where we knew what we were doing, it all went a little crazy. So I think in common with a lot of people, we ended up desperately laying the tracks, trying to keep ahead of the speeding train and the rampaging penguin, and hoping it would all work out. So we launched very quickly into home delivery for staff, because part of students' digital poverty is also the poverty of their academics and lecturers in being able to communicate with them effectively. If they're on that houseboat, if they're trying to deliver on their phone, if they're on an iPad, then it was really difficult for them to engage properly with the students. So in some ways, we did have to put staff at the front of that line so they were able to deliver what students needed to engage with. And then we could work out which of the students then needed further help. So our main challenges was hardware. Students didn't really want run-of-the-mill laptops. They didn't want standard specs. Quite often they've got something along those lines themselves, or they use a tablet. If you took Chrome devices, we had Surface Go's. What they want from us is high-performance compute. They want the really high-end Macs. They want high-end PCs. They want to come on site and do quite intensive rendering, video processing. They want to be able to do complex graphics and animation. They need big screens. These are the things we just couldn't supply them in bulk remotely, particularly with this supply chain, as has been referenced. Software was a huge minefield for us because we never really thought particularly, bearing in mind the reliance on hardware on site, about what software could be provided remotely or people could install on their own devices. Adobe, as I say, has to have a line of its own because it's a major problem. This isn't confined to 1, 2, 3 programs or subject areas. This is a good 80% of our students require Adobe at some point. And it was very problematic that we could not give access to that remotely. And that's before we get on to the specialist resources. We've got whole studios set up to do TV production, film, video, broadcast. We've got render and storage farm, all of which was deliberately set up to be accessible on site. Because the thinking at the time was that students would need advice and guidance to use it, which is absolutely true, but it didn't really bear in mind that some of these students might actually not be able to come on site at all, and neither would the staff. So we're at a very low level there. The Great Firewall was problematic. I've now done 3 studies with our students to try and understand whether a VPN for London, Shanghai would help them if that's the poverty they're experiencing, that they just simply can't connect from where they are, that a range of resources are not available to them, or whether it really is that last mile issue. Have they got the right device? What's their broadband like? How many other people are in their home? And then we're getting back into the complexity of trying to support students whose whereabouts and situation aren't very clear and who you can't immediately offer a good fix to. So all of that affected the service. And then that affects confidence. Particularly if people don't have the right equipment, they can be quite shy about raising it. They can feel quite awkward about it. With the supply chain, there was little we could do at that stage, certainly not on the type of equipment they required. And we certainly couldn't be shipping it overseas. So we've had to reach a number of sort of accommodations and try and direct our students to the services that they can benefit from. And this has had a knock-on effect into assessment. So if a student is experiencing digital poverty and another student has a really high-end laptop, that's going to impact the quality of the work they produce. So how do you manage that? How do you grade it? How do you engage with the student over it and feedback over it? So there's been a lot of discussions within courses on that, about how you kind of level that playing field in terms of recognising the content of the work and the artistic value and the creativity in it, without judging it also partly by the components people have used. Then on the knowledge subject, we found students have been very vulnerable to fraud and some aggressive marketing. That buy this, it will give you wonderful broadband, it will give you a mobile hotspot. This is the tool for you. Sign up to Adobe per month and find that you can't unsign for some time. And we've had a few students who've fallen foul of phishing, which comes back to that sort of savviness, because so many students now spend so much time online in social media, they're actually strangely trusting. So we have had a student who was being extorted actually for if she wanted to enroll, then she had to give whoever this was who'd compromised their account money that the student couldn't afford, and they were terrified they'd lose their place. But because we weren't able to answer the phones and keep up with the number of inquiries, they were left feeling actually quite vulnerable. So they ended talking to our service desk quite a bit over that. We managed to sort them out in the end and make sure that they were secure going forward. We put them under MFA. We gave them good advice, but I mean that could have ended up very badly for that student. So there was definitely a poverty of knowledge there about the sort of things to look out for and the threats to be wary of. So mind you, on the timeline for us, so March was the day I came back from holiday, strangely enough. I was very lucky and went away just before. And so we came back and suddenly discovered, right, the world is changing, what do we do? Adobe came up with the Creative Cloud at Home offer, and that was something of a godsend, because then we could set up remote access to our existing classroom computers that had Adobe on, and we could unite the students who needed Adobe with the machines that had it. The difficulty came after July, when that offer was withdrawn but we had students back on campus, so we were able to fend it off for a period. But then, of course, in December, students left campus again. So we were then left for the rest of this academic year with the conundrum of what do we do, that Adobe is critical to these courses, but our license does not include provision. So we've certainly sold an awful lot more ETLA licenses than we normally do. And we've also had some individual faculties buying those licenses. And that's something I'll come on to later when we get into fairness and parity. So look at our students, 45% internationals. That's why the Great Firewall became quite a pressing concern. We have a lot of short courses as well. What we could do for students who maybe would only be with us for 2 to 6 to 10 weeks, you wouldn't start shipping laptops out to them in those numbers in that time. So a lot of those students that would have been relying on coming on campus and contributing revenue to the university, that operation more or less ceased. FE students, pre-sessional, foundation, outreach. Some of these include school children, so up to the age of 18. So some of those were manageable via their institution. But a lot of the students who would maybe have come to university and gained confidence in that environment and with the type of facilities and learning that they would be doing were cut off. So they've not really been able to learn and develop as they might have done. And we weren't really able, due to the nature of these courses and their length, to really do much about that. Going back to some courses buying licenses for their students, we do have significant cost of study pressures outside the digital. So we do find that students need to buy materials for their fashion. They need to buy materials to be creating sculpture. They need materials for 3D printing. It's quite expensive to be an art student, surprisingly. So it's not just digital. It can be something of the last straw, that if they're just about managing to get all of these materials ready, and then they've suddenly got to provide their own laptop in an environment where they're not able to find casual work either, this really put a lot of students into hardship. Now, what we'd never really considered before in terms of levelling that playing field was the 32% of students in the quintiles 1 and 2. So because we had the hardship fund, we've got extensive on-site resources, so it never became a huge issue. Once those students were not able to use our resources, that really put hardship into a very, very bright spotlight. So hardship requests increased by 224% during COVID. And a lot of that was to do with not being able to come on site and use the resources they come to rely on, not having the part-time work that enabled them to get by. The hardship fund can provide up to £700 normally for equipment for online learning. That includes an amount for the Adobe license, but £700 isn't going to get them a high-end laptop that they might need. So there was still a gap there about what they would need. So we thought about setting up maybe discounted laptops, but really the supply chain blew that out of the water fairly early on, because it was simply going to take too long to get the laptops to students that they needed. The work we did with students, student union and with courses, showed that really students favoured too wide a range of devices. They particularly wanted Macs, which had the worst supply chain. So either we ended up trying to predict the right sort of devices and then ended up with a stock of something that we couldn't sell on but couldn't use in labs either, or it was just simply going to be too late for them. So that was problematic. So then we went to Access Anywhere, which we did 3 different ways, one of which was the remote control of Windows devices. What we had was a lot of situations where we had up to 20 machines in a room, but under social distancing, we could only use about 8 of them, some of them slightly more, some of them slightly less. So what remote access enabled us to do was to run teaching sessions in those rooms and unite people off campus with machines that were on campus. If some students were on site, some students were in halls, some students never arrived on campus, then some could be in the class and some could not, and the lecturer could see them all equally. So that worked out actually really well. It involved a mad scramble to get to site and install the client on all the machines that we needed to. We got there. We also found that we were able to open specialist machines up outside of teaching hours. So that really helped a lot of students who were finding that they had nothing at home. Then, of course, we had the Mac issue. Virtualizing Macs wasn't really as easy as the Windows. So we've ended up with remote control of existing devices, which we squirrel away in a data center. Given that half our estate is Mac, and none of those users were willing to switch to Windows, we really needed to find a solution. So Splashtop is really good. It's worked out very well and quite simple as these things go to set up and use, and the students have engaged really well with it. So we'll certainly be looking to keep some of that. Our main work, though, is around the virtual desktops. So that is our virtual provision, and that's really interesting about how you save money against labs, what it does to your device program, and the difference in teaching if you start divorcing the compute from the physical device. So that's something we're going to work. We had an unexpected COVID issue there where they delivered a crucial bit of kit to the wrong address, which we were promptly locked out of. Then 2 months later, we got back in and ended up almost demolishing the post room to find it. So that was difficult, shall we say, because with the extra GPUs required, or we couldn't run the graphics in our data center. So we had all sorts of problems over that, but we're now running that successfully over some courses. So that's going really well, and that will certainly be our future. However, the courses use Adobe, and at the moment, Adobe aren't very keen on the concept that we've got computers that are licensed, which are not being used, students which would normally use those computers, but which aren't sat next to them right now. So is someone really missing out if we unite those two things, if we're not doubling up? So discussions continue on that one, but certainly from 2,000 DTLA license, we sold nearly 6,000. So we're now committed to that for this year as well. We were looking at how we might fund Adobe licenses, say half our students, but it turned out to be prohibitive this year because of the uncertainty over budgets and recruitment. So we're still working on that one. And then those departments that bought the bundles for their students, well, that was difficult because not all poverty is digital. If some students have had the blessing of £50 for an Adobe license, what are we giving those students who maybe would prefer materials? Who need paper for their printers, or who need a new printer, or who need help for their broadband bills. It turned into quite a difficult conversation about fairness and levelling that playing field if we were only going to focus on one thing. So yeah, as I'm sure many of us are aware of, we're in a sustained campaign now to bring Adobe around to understanding this, that we're not trying to pull any fast ones here, we're just trying to unite unused computers and Adobe licenses. So we need to find some way to square that circle, really. Back on the software, we had 300 software packages to student-facing computers, and it's an awful lot to go through to try and work out what we can give remote access to. And given the issue with Macs and Windows and all the software packages, that's why we've not gone into remote app deployment at the moment. We likely will, because now we're settling down into next year. Thinking on with a lot of people, we're thinking about what are the good things from this year we can take forward and use. Other digital facilities, well, there's 3D printing, there's the cameras, there's graphics. So all of these things that are in the realm of the digital, but these are going to be limited to on-site. There's no doubt about that. So digital poverty, I think, is only partially about the device in your hand. There's a whole world of other devices out there in the digital realm. So one thing we tried to do is give clear guidance. So the kit list version 1 in a collegiate institution was a little bit of a trial because nobody really wanted to do it centrally. There's a lot of different flavours of it. So what we ended up doing was publishing in assorted areas rather than communicating advice. So we've tried to address that this year and at least gone to the minimum. As a student, the minimum you need to effectively gauge is this. And you may well find that you will benefit from XYZ as well, but the minimum is this. So if you want to engage in UAL online, this is what you will need. So full extent of digital property, certainly for us and its impact, is still emerging. It's still becoming clear just how wide-ranging this is. It requires investment, which is going to be definitely going into our next investment round, and some creative thinking about where there's an obvious answer, maybe where there is not. Certainly not just access to computers on the desk. Software licensing for us is an absolute nightmare with the number of packages involved and some of their complexity. And the next challenge, I think, is a common thread that blended and online learning is here to stay. I think everybody's looking at how to take forward the good things from the past 18 months and put them in the future. So that does require some of our sort of emergency levelling up procedures and measures to become permanent parts of our service offering. And in some cases, that's quite different than a temporary solution. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Lisa, I just want to say thank you very much. What an interesting perspective from UAL in relation to what the students were asking for, and obviously your insight to it on the ground level. So just want to say thank you for sharing and bringing that to the table. So I'm just going to hand over. There was one particular question that I can probably come back, but I just want to hand over before we move on to our last speaker for some of the questions that have actually come in. There's a clear running theme for things like software, which was on your last slide, Adobe. There's a running theme, and I could see, taking it back to what Trevor was mentioning earlier, I don't want to mention the word lobbying, but from a communal perspective, if the institutes are approaching organisations, not just Adobe, and that buy-in, that pull-in power, that communal power, some real strengths there. One question that I think was raised previously, I know Esther has dropped out, but she raised the question in terms of where the students were located, geographical location, and what they were trying to access. Maybe you don't have that info, but I could, I guess it was a question posed to other institutes as well as yours. But did you have anything? Did you have any of that data to hand in terms of?
Bodies around the 25,000 mark, 45% international. That was a substantial number who actually didn't come to the UK at all. So they were spread worldwide through the EU, South America, Australia, all the way over to China and Japan. So we had a range of. As for domestic students, we had about 900 came to halls and stayed there. They've managed to come over during a window in travel restrictions and then couldn't get out again. So they were kind of trapped there. And of course, digital poverty could end up with actual hunger, because how are they going to eat while walled up?
Yeah. It's very much an evolving topic as well. Yes, yeah.
In there, so that requires them to have the facility to be able to engage with that. Yeah, we had a lot of students spread very, very widely, and in London wanted to go.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Yeah, and I think you've partly answered the question during your talk from when it were raised in terms of what they wanted access to. You kind of covered on that in terms of they wanted high-end devices, more so on the Mac side of things as opposed to the Windows-based PC. But yeah, thank you. Some really rich content.
Finding, particularly some of these design and high-end areas, they'd spend their first 2 years most of saving up. Machine. They wanted to work, so they were heavily dependent on us.
Thank you. Yeah. No, some great content, and I think that leads us. Just one last round of applause for Lisa for the content that she has covered. Really much appreciated. Really fantastic content. Just before that, obviously, brings us on to our final speaker. Thank you, Lisa. All right, so our last joint speakers are going to be presenting to us from the University of Nottingham. We've got Chris Parry, the Associate Director of Partnering and Innovation, and Lewis Neves, Digital Learning Director for the Faculty of Engineering. Thank you for coming forward, Chris, Lewis, welcome. If you want to maybe bring your presentation forward, we'll jump straight in with yours.
Hi, so good afternoon. My name is Luís Neves. I am the Digital Learning Director for the Faculty of Engineering, so I am an academic civil engineer, by the way. Chris Parry is one of our esteemed members of what we used to call IT and now call digital services, and he is responsible for innovation partnerships, which means he pretty much gets the fun out of the DTS. And as the title says, we're going to be talking about the Windows Virtual Desktop. Why did we invest in this? Why did we invest in this when we did? What were the good news, the bad news? And also, I think we're going to talk a little bit about the process under which we developed the delivery and the implementation of the virtual desktop, because I think that was quite unusual and actually has been very informative to us how we should go forward in doing this kind of activities in the future. So digital poverty for us comes from three fundamental directions. Poor connectivity, which restricts the ability of students to access content and interact with content. Inadequate devices, because they are either inexistent, not good enough, or not compatible. Sometimes they can be very expensive, like Macs, but just not compatible with what we need students to do. And then lack of skills and confidence. Today, I'm going to talk mostly about inadequate devices, but it's impossible to separate this from connectivity and lack of skills. So why is this important to us, and why is this particularly important in engineering? Well, there's fundamentally two reasons. We had a huge increase in the importance of digital education over the last decades. That's a fact of life. That happened in two ways. The first is there was a huge increase in the amount of the importance of digital resources. So whereas when I was a student back in the day, we got notes in paper and we had lectures on blackboards. Now we have lectures on tablets and iPads. We have the notes in PDFs. We watch videos. We see, we hear podcasts. So all of the content is now in digital formats, and things like LMSs like Moodle and Blackboard are absolutely critical, and getting the access to this is absolutely fundamental. For us as engineers, there's a second problem, which is the way we work has changed. And the way engineers work went from a paper base and a calculator, and we've seen an increased importance of computer-enabled work. So this kind of image I have here on the right of someone with a very old computer in the corner, but actually doing all the work on a printed drawing with these beautiful rulers that we all learned to work with back in the days. This is gone. And this is gone in the industry, and it's gone in the Faculty of Engineering in the university. So the education in STEM, and particularly in engineering science, moved from a paper and a pencil work to things like programming tools, MATLAB, Python, Visual Basic, whatever, simulation using a range of specialized software packages. I don't know all of them. There was dozens of them that came up when we started this work in last March. You know, some of them are as specialized as analyzing the flow of chemicals within a pan when you are producing a new chemical compound or modeling a building or a bridge, which is what I tend to do. And on top of that, we had a bunch of drawing packages for projects. And I thought I understood this, being a civil engineer and all. I don't. The packages in civil are completely different from the ones in mechanical engineering. Architects use different things. Product developers use absolutely completely different things. And what is common in all of this is that they are resources hungry. They require an awful lot of resources. And some students were able to do it at home in their own desktops, laptops. Many students were not able to do it at home because even if they had a device, the device was not powerful enough to run many of these software packages. So the problems is that these packages are often very expensive. We cannot ask any student to go and buy MATLAB. Well, some of these packages like Plaxis and Katia, they won't even be sold to a student. These are extremely specialized, developed by a defense industry. Katia, for example, is developed by Dassault, which makes airplanes. And the software is only available to a very limited set of clients, and they only allow the software to be run on very particular types of desktops. They have very stringent requirements about where the software runs, and if the computer does not fulfill those requirements, it's a no-go. They will not allow or support. And so we could clearly not allow students to need this software to complete their projects. And so the traditional approach we had is the same as we had with everyone else, which was we had shared computer rooms. We had almost 3,000 physical computers, most of them relatively expensive. So roughly between 800 and 1,000 pounds each. So just an order of magnitude. We had short-term loan computers and laptops that were available for loan to students. And then when students struggled with getting a device, we had a hardship fund. We used to run study skill sessions. And of course, as all of us, we provided campus and accommodations Wi-Fi. Now, it is very clear when you look at this that out of a sudden, 3/4 of this will not be available during COVID. There's going to be no computer rooms. There's going to be no physical computers. There's going to be study skill sessions have to change, and there's going to be limited Wi-Fi on campus or limited use for Wi-Fi on campus. So, but computer rooms work fine. You know, they had limitations. They limited the working hours of students. So students actually had to make use of the computer rooms, would have to work within a time window, which was narrower than other students. And it would sometimes promote long working days and not particularly healthy habits. Students would stay there forever, not have dinner, not have lunch, not take breaks. It is very difficult also to work in a group in a computer room because the other users of the room are actually quite conscious about noise. And so this is a place where working by yourself is fine, but working with colleagues and discussing a project, which is a key aspect of engineering, working as a group is a core skill for an engineer. And we want our students to work in groups between 4 and 6 throughout the entire course. And so having computer rooms which do not allow or do not facilitate this kind of learning was a major issue. And the other problem is that you're frequently interrupted. So if you are actually mindful of healthy practices and you try to working at 9 a.m. and work until 5, these computer rooms were used for independent work, but they were also used for delivering timetable classes. So you'll be working for an hour and then someone would come and says, I need a room for the next 2 hours. The student would have to go and find a different room, interrupt his work, probably lose a piece of work because he didn't save it to the right place or they didn't save it to the right place. And so in the end, this strongly disadvantaged students that did not have powerful devices. We did explore the idea of allowing students to install software in their own devices. And although this is very helpful for many students, it is not particularly helpful for some students, because often the devices are incompatible because they're older, because they have different operating systems, because they don't have the capacity we want. Second problem is supporting students with IT issues is a problem when we are using computers which are controlled and that we know. When he goes into trying to sort out a problem with a computer that belongs to a student, and God knows what is done or what they have done to the computer before coming to support, is almost impossible. Remotely is literally impossible. The other problem, of course, is that there's a range of specialized software which is not only very expensive, but the university licenses do not allow installation in private devices. We have played with the idea of connecting to on-premise license servers. And for some software, this works, but it is a complex and is a bit of a clunky solution to the problem. Again, even if we manage to do all of this, it strongly disadvantages students that do not have powerful devices or the funding to buy those. Chris.
Thank you, Lewis. As a number of us have talked about so far, the kind of closure of computer room facilities, those shared facilities in March 2020, was a big catalyst for us to need to move staff and students to working remotely and being able to access all those facilities that Lewis has just talked about. We also need to make sure we continue teaching, because it was a critical time for us for final year projects, for research projects, and we needed to keep our students continually engaging. Pop to the next slide. So very quickly, most of us had moved off campus at this point. And we're already dealing with some of the other countries that were closing down at the time. So for the first time, what we did was created a cross-functional team that had student testers. It had our digital learning directors, so Lewis and his colleagues, of which we have one for each of the 5 faculties, and a DTS team that needs to come together and build basically the Windows virtual desktop very, very quickly. And what we needed to do is have maximum impact very quickly as well, to cover that broad spread of 5 faculties, from arts to social sciences to engineering to medicine to science, to be able to provide that application range and that access to those students, so they didn't start disengaging. As many of you have talked about so far, the kind of major license review that we needed to do with both software managers, the individual partners and suppliers, but in many cases our lawyers, where we needed to talk about specific pieces of software that we wanted our students to access that weren't allowed to be accessed from the countries in which they were located. As Lewis talked about earlier, there's some of our aerospace software that you aren't allowed to access in particular places, and we needed to make sure that access and restrictions were closely monitored and managed. So the team worked together. We got a MVP released after about 4 or 5 days, once we kind of knew the system was up running. Licenses were fairly okay from kind of generic perspective, and get people testing, make sure it was something that our user community really wanted and they would start using. And then we started to add to that around automation of access, our uptake and adoption activities, to make sure our staff and our teachers felt comfortable teaching and using it as a tool, but also that our students felt comfortable going into a teaching session where they'd be expected to use this service, and they had the software installed, they felt comfortable with where they needed to save things. And that was delivered through both drop-in sessions, but also through video and online help. That then led us to starting to develop more the higher cost and higher specification kind of engineering computer science desktops, because we knew that the majority of our 35,000 students didn't need access to that GPU or high-spec desktop. We only needed a subset, and therefore we could control costs more closely and ensure that the Faculty of Engineering weren't being compromised by the Faculty of Medicine that weren't using the service as much. But also that helped with some of our licensing restrictions as well. So we created the more powerful desktops to do simulation, to do CAD, and we limited that use by module registration. So we knew exactly who had access to which desktop. But we also then started to trial Azure Labs, and where we're able to add in that higher level of GPU access required by some of those simulation pieces of software, just to make sure that students weren't doing the same things they would do in the computer room, which was set a job running and wait 4 or 5 hours, go to sleep next to the computer, pop a post-it note on the front of it saying don't use it, and we're able to do some of those jobs in significantly less time, which enabled them a better kind of study life balance, I suppose, in the way they were working. Pop to the next slide for me, Lewis. So what we did, we provided access to over 300 software applications. Over 7,500 people had accessed that service since since August the 1st and the end of May. A bit like Andrew mentioned earlier, the concurrent usage probably is nearer 1,000 people at any one time, not the full 35,000 or the full 7,000. So as Andrew described, use is very much, I'll go on, I'll use it for what I need to use it for and move away. Unlike a computer room desktop, which was, I go into the room, I use it, I log out, and it remains switched on for the rest of the day until our power saving kicks in. We also provided then access to over 400 students to this dedicated Azure Labs desktop, which enabled those GPU level access, but also those higher memory intensive dedicated task activities. A bit like other people have talked about, we had approximately 500 laptops that students were able to loan. We were doing lots of 1-2 week loans to start with, and then semester long loans, and then quite a lot through our assessment period where people were moving online and didn't really want to trust their own piece of equipment to continue working. So people wanted a device that they could trust. We also increased the budget for hardship funding during this academic year as well. Some of that was spent on laptops, some of that was spent on connectivity, some of that was spent on some of the areas that our last speaker was speaking around in the fact that our student income was reducing, and therefore they couldn't afford to pay for the things that they would normally be paying for, such as broadband and devices. But the really interesting part of it now is we've now removed 900 computers from our 3,000 computer room estate. Those aren't going to replace. We're never going to replace those ones, and that's a big part of what our future is going to be. Is going to be making sure I'll start with the first one. We start reimagining the kind of space design for our computer rooms of the future, that they're far more collaborative, where people can bring in their devices, and if they haven't got devices, the university is able to help with those devices. Also, that our virtual desktop allows access from any device, so therefore if people want to go and buy a really high-end laptop, they can, but still use the Windows Virtual Desktop. Where people want to use a mobile phone, wouldn't particularly want to use that for long periods, but they can do. But also they can use some really cheap, low-end devices to be able to access a very powerful service. And that means it's more affordable for our students, that are only buying that laptop for their study activity. But also it means that as an organisation, as stocks allow it and as manufacturing allow it, we can buy slightly cheaper computers, but have more of them and provide those to our students in need. But also, we found that increased usable lifetime of devices has been a big part of it. That we don't need a brand new device to use this, and as one of the speakers mentioned earlier, going and being able to get a second-hand device, handing some of our students our desktops that were in computer rooms to go in to make sure that they were able to run right at the very beginning of the pandemic. But also in doing this, before the pandemic, we ran a pilot of Windows Virtual Desktop, where we found there was a really close link between students that needed computers for their studies using a device that they were used to, that had the adaptability that they wanted. It had the keyboard that they wanted, the mouse that they wanted. Actually, that led to them using the software in a more effective and efficient way, and therefore starting to impact their assessment and their grades. And as I mentioned earlier, we're really now starting to work with people like our computer science department and our engineering department on reimagining what space looks like for the traditional computer room. Long gone as the days of single row by row computers, and more into collaborative spaces where students can work together as we would find in the workplace. Pop on to the next slide for me. But some of the challenges that have obviously been still highlighted as part of this session has been that importance of a reliable internet connectivity, both from the campus, but also from private accommodation, and more so during the pandemic from international home connectivity. So what we were able to do, and lucky enough to do for some of our Chinese located students, was actually take them through our China campus, so that they had a specific direct access back onto CERNET, and then back into the UK to be able to access particular services that weren't restricted by those license agreements. But as we've highlighted again today, that we need to, as a sector, to start influencing inflexible license and software providers. I think a number of us have come up against that, and I think as we start to move forward, I think license providers will need to do this anyway, but I think as a sector, the more that we can do, the better. But also balance that with providing a range of comprehensive induction and training, not only for our students, but for our staff. We need to make sure people feel confident with using these digital services wherever they may be. And once the confidence comes, that's where creativity comes, that's where better results come, that's where higher results in assessment come, and that's where innovation comes. So that's the kind of Nottingham journey, and thank you for listening. If anybody has any questions, please do feel free to ask them.
Chris, Lewis, thank you very much. Some really interesting content. I just want to probably take a minute to just give a round of applause, particularly for the content that were actually covered, before jumping in with any of the questions. I've got a question for each of you. One particularly that has this running theme that's probably been present during today's speakers in relation to that theme of, I wouldn't say fairness, but it's more the journey. I know Lewis introduced and started, and I saw a couple of comments relating to set squares. But obviously that transition going over to podcasts, and if everyone, to Trevor put a really interesting post into the chat relating to what Microsoft are doing in relation to cloud based PCs. That journey is the point that I'm posing the question to Lewis. I guess, Lewis, over to you. If you could maybe share a little bit about your view, your it's not quite vision, but in terms of where you see it transitioning, where you see it going. I'm
not really sure. I think what we found is that we went from a situation where we provided every student and every member of staff with the same piece of kit. It was very standard. It was an overkill for many students. It was inadequate for others, and it was absolutely useless for many. And we've been thinking a little bit here about undergrad students, but some of our students are postgrad students. Some of them are doing postgraduate with research, and they also need devices which are extremely powerful. And in order for them to be able to deliver, state-of-the-art research, they need computers which we can possibly provide them. What we're doing here is giving a baseline to everyone, which is a basic desktop, and that covers the needs of 70% of our students. And then saying, okay, then on top of that, we have another 30% or 25% of our students who need a bit more. And they get a desktop, which is a little bit more expensive, but has extra features. And then we can go and say, but for this particular task, you need something a lot more powerful than this. And Christine mentioned that, but we gave some of our students computers that cost around £5,000, £8,000 each. There was no way that we would ever be able to buy £57,000 computer for students to do a 3D modeling of a car for their final year project. We just wouldn't be able to do this. So what this allows us is to actually customize what we do to a level that was never possible before. And I think that is going to make us think in very different ways. And it's very uncomfortable, I must admit, in some senses, it's very uncomfortable to think like that. But I think the key point for me is to put the money where it's needed rather than spread it across the entire institution. And I don't think there's a way back from this. I'm not saying that this journey was not without difficulties and issues, and especially when it involves things like assessment and using exams, for example, which was a big challenge. But I don't see us going back. I really don't see us going back. I don't know. Chris, I think, agrees that this is the way we're going to go forward. And above all, give every student what they need rather than give all students the same thing.
Yeah, thank you, Lewis. Yeah, a themed, Lisa touched on it previously. How do we actually grade our students' content fairly, given the disparity of even the equipment that they're actually using? So yes, really, really key topics that are actually being brought to the table. So yeah, thank you, Lewis. I've got a slightly different question for yourself, Chris, relating to cost. From my perspective, as soon as Azure tends to be mentioned, the high cost, you able to share your thoughts from a Nottingham perspective in relation to what led to the choices, the decisions?
Yes, so I think we probably spend a third of what we would spend on a normal computer room refurbishment in a year. So as Lewis said, what we would normally do is replace a quarter of our computer rooms, so 750, 800 computers in a year. So let's between 800 and £1,000 each. We probably spent a third of that on Azure Desktop, and a lot of that has been down to the way we've designed the desktop. So to make sure that we deliver the 70% with the minimum amount possible, and we make sure that experience is good, and then being able to use capacity planning in our cloud operations teams to work out when's the busy time, when isn't the busy time, and working with Lewis and his colleagues to understand when's the high assessment areas, when's the low assessment times, and really understand that kind of, dare I say, that business, the academic and business life cycle of the university, so we can downscale our services and then massively increase them during assessment periods. And as Lewis said, then design a desktop for those high-end users that's used for a particular number of hours by a particular group of people. If we'd have offered that same £5,000 to £8,000 worth of laptops, worth of desktop to every student, we would never have been able to afford this. And I think by taking that different approach, it's probably added some cost into the administration of the service. But that's been massively outweighed by, I think, the benefits that the students have gained and the benefits and confidence that I think our academic colleagues have gained through different types of service being available. And dare I say it, the fact that we're providing this to our computer science department, who usually go off and like to do their own thing, install their own software, etc. We've sat with them, we've designed, we've built that. They've got a specific desktop that meets all of their needs. They control it, they understand it, but it's all got the security and the administration that it no longer needs to sit with their teams. I think is an advantage to both areas, and I think that's a massive step forward that I think most digital services can take with working with their users. So cost significantly less if it's managed and controlled in the right way. And if anything, feedback to Microsoft. We have a really close relationship with the Azure team on what worked, what didn't work, and that helped us significantly as well.
Great stuff, Chris. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and some real positive feedback in terms of what you're seeing from the end users, which is where it really counts. Yeah. So that brings us to our last set of speakers as far as today's presentations are concerned. If just one last round of applause for Lewis and Chris for the content that they've actually covered, that actually takes us into our discussion in relation to the final few minutes of today. So if there were any pressing questions, I guess the purpose of this last part of today's discussion will be to just open it back up to you to pose any questions that you may have for any of the speakers that have spoke today in relation to the actual content for which they have covered. So I'd like to just maybe bring forward each of our speakers who have actually spoke during today's event. Mark, obviously from JISC, Stephanie, Andrew from Strathclyde, Lisa from UAL, Chris and Lewis. If we do actually have the opportunity for those actually still present, partly a roundtable discussion, but feel free to pop any questions for your panel into the chat just as we bring today's event to a close. So I'll pose maybe the first question in relation to fairness in terms of grading. I know Lisa and Lewis have just recently covered it. It scratched. It was ever so slightly covered from previous content, but I'll just put that out there in terms of how would you envisage that being tackled? How are you tackling that for your institutes? What are the kind of conversations that are being had around this topic? Maybe Lisa, if you could lead with that. Lewis, if you could come in second.
Yeah, happy to give a bit more background. It did prove to be quite a tortuous subject. And I have to say the path of least resistance on it, with everything else to be thought about, was quite often, well, if we can't do something for everyone, then there's no sweets for anyone. And that seemed to be the way it went, really, because we talked about, well, we did a big executive board around Adobe, for example, about funding for students, because we thought that's the amount we could sell. We could definitely deal with 10,000 of them. It was, well, what are you doing for the rest, and how much would that cost, and what do they want? And then it just became too much like hard work, really, I think, particularly in times of crisis, to really work out, well, what do they want? What can we do? Because it's not a position we'd come in, because the students kind of compete to come in. They are expected to have certain tools of the trade. So we'd never really thought about this enormously before in terms of digital poverty in that gulf, because it had been masked by the on-campus. So yeah, I regret to say we're still slightly in the sweets for everyone or nothing for anyone.
Thank you. Yeah.
Research to be done.
That's interesting. I know, Chris, some of the content is new. We don't actually have stats. It's so early. It's so just new and I wouldn't say ever evolving, but just materializing. Lewis, did you have any comments on the actual the fairness of marking topic? Andrew, I noticed you were with us earlier. I maybe wanted to ask you too.
I find the issue particularly painful, I'll be honest, because although we tell the students that they don't need software A, B, and C, and D in order to have a good mark, they realize that the students have this and that tool actually have an advantage. And I think we need to address this from a very pragmatic approach and says, no, we're not going to accept that. You guys are going to have to work with the tool that we provide. We provide you a tool that's good enough, and that's a tool you have to play with. Because otherwise, it's like allowing someone to take a calculator to the exam and saying that everyone else has to do the calculations by hand is intrinsically extremely unfair. And so I think either we work with providers like Adobe, which is a pain point for all of us, and say, look, we need to be reasonable about this. And if you want to keep on being the main player in the industry, we need to allow our students to be able to use your software at a reasonable and fair cost, which is not the case right now. Or we need to find alternative solutions and accept that maybe the quality of the work will not be quite as good as you would be in different circumstances, but at least it's fair on everyone. But if I may, I would like to pick something Lisa said, which is really important to me. I think COVID might have made digital poverty worse. I think it did. It's beyond discussion. But also, he uncovered issues that were already there and that were not clear to us, because the computer rooms, some access to campus did provide some level of a level play field, but it was not really leveled. It was just not quite as slanted. And I think COVID made us all very aware that this was never very fair, just a little bit worse now.
Thank you, Lewis. Andrew, did you want to maybe come forward and comment also? I know one hand raised, Stephanie. We'll come over to yourself just next. Yeah.
Yeah. Just to echo the comments of the other speakers, we certainly noticed our initial pilot with the virtual desktop was around courses like engineering courses that taught specific applications like SolidWorks, and we had some students who had equipment that would work and others that didn't. So that was a very pressing need, because people could complete coursework, other people just all of a sudden had no access to it whatsoever, whether they had a Macintosh or they didn't have a device at all. So we have managed to address it a bit, but as you saw from our presentation, we delivered virtual desktop thinking we've solved this, but we hadn't, because people didn't have the devices to connect to the virtual desktop. So I think in future it will be a blend of providing devices, providing broadband, providing virtual desktops. So you have the full range of facilities, an access device, a device that can connect to cloud-based resources, and delivering a set of applications through the cloud.
Thank you, Andrew.
Can I just ask, before we go on to other things, I want to do a quick survey, ask how many people are using virtual machines. Sean, if you could pop one in for me, just to ask a yes or no question. Are you using virtual desktop type programs for delivering this?
Yeah, that's a great question, Trev. In terms of maybe Institute, yeah, and yes, no, yeah, that's a great question. Could I bring Stephanie forward, and we'll probably move. So if you look in the chat, there's literally a poll in relation to yes, no, and then submit as to whether you are using or not using, your institute is using or not using in relation to the virtual desktops. Trev, I'm assuming Azure is what we'll home in on, as opposed to any of the other VMs, virtual desktops.
Well, it's more the kind of technique, whether we're using that type of a technique, and there are probably various different alternatives.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see whether that's technique we're homing in on, and that might be something that would inform us for a better session for helping you with that kind of thing in the future.
Very much so. Stephanie, could I ask you maybe to come forward as far as things go and just maybe unmute, switch on your camera. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo Lewis's point about COVID kind of exposed an issue in terms of digital poverty that we knew about, but had probably been sweeping under the carpet a little bit. But it would be good to see, because the digital exclusion is so clear, to actually broaden that discussion out further, because in terms of assessment and support and flexibility for students, it's not a level playing field. So even if digital poverty is sorted, you still have some students with caring responsibilities who are living in unsafe or chaotic homes, who are experiencing homelessness. They have a completely different situation to others that are in much more stable environments, and it'd be really good if we could sort of take, we've shone a spotlight on this, what else can we do?
I think that's one of the things that hasn't come out within this, but one of the things I've heard a lot. It's okay for me. My kids have grown up and left, and I'm using my son's bedroom for an office. That's great. But I'm on calls with younger people who are in their parents' house in a bedroom with siblings fighting in the background. It's not so easy for them to concentrate on their work or their studies or anything else, just purely because of the physical location of them, as well as what their connectivity is like and what kind of computer they can afford.
And it scratches ever so slightly on the topic of well-being. I know ucisa have covered this. It's not necessarily a plug, but if for anyone who's connected and missed that, by all means check the repository. But the theme being, when we're into exam period and when we've got it such that students the only device they have is their mobile phone to obviously connect in this online environment. You're right, some of the stats highlighting this and really turning over the rock to obviously show the geographics of this. I know Esther raised the question, where are the students connecting in from? What is it that they actually want to connect? But just something in terms of the numbers seems to be coming through throughout today's session. I think it's probably fitting that we maybe put up the last slide and mention maybe next month's event in relation to if you have enjoyed today's event and would like to obviously contribute from a community perspective. Again, I guess there's if you'd like to maybe put forward an expression of interest, feel free to contact the ucisa events team. If you would obviously like to speak at any of the upcoming or share content. So just, I guess in closing from us, the ucisa London group to you, we'd like to maybe say a massive thank you, just one last round of applause to all of the speakers that have actually contributed and made today's event exactly what it is. If the speakers could feel free to switch on your cameras and obviously just by all means come forward. Some fantastic content, and behind the scenes it is very much worth mentioning. We've got a ucisa team, Sean, Richard, I noticed Bird was in. It's these guys that are making obviously this happen. Trevor, Julian have obviously just been monitoring the chat and responding to the chat and posting into the chat during today. So massive thank you to all and everyone who has made today's event exactly what it is. One last.
Going forward as well, we obviously we've got other events upcoming. Next month we're looking at an event on audiovisual technology that you can see underneath. And the following month, we're looking at supporting women in technology. So if you would like to speak to any one of those events, or if you know somebody that would be good for one of those events, please let us know through that event's email address below. and we'll contact them and or yourself. And it's great to have a go. It's great we can give you some CPD points for actually doing the lectures and the presentations as well. So please feel free.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. And that brings us to probably the end of today's session. Really much appreciated. Yeah, really much appreciated to all the speakers.